March 1955, Bumpy Johnson demonstrated that economic power could achieve what violence never could. When Vincent Mel ejected him from the restaurant, Bumpy didn't retaliate with force. He orchestrated a complete economic boycott that brought a 3-generation family business to its knees within 24 hours. This story illustrates how marginalized communities, when organized and united, possess tremendous economic influence that white business owners underestimated. Bumpy understood that in 1950s Harlem, black customers weren't just patrons, they were the lifeblood of local commerce. By mobilizing the community's purchasing power, he created a pressure point more effective than any physical confrontation. The genius of Bumpy's response lay in its simplicity and its devastating effectiveness. He didn't need to throw a single punch, smash a single window, or make a single threat. All he had to do was let the word spread through Harlem's intricate social networks that Vincent Mel's restaurant was no longer a place where the community was welcome. In a neighborhood where information traveled faster than any newspaper could print it, where barbers, beauticians, and corner store owners served as nodes in a vast communication network, Bumpy's message reached every potential customer within hours. By the next evening, Mel's restaurant sat empty, not because people were afraid of Bumpy's violence, but because they understood the principle at stake and chose solidarity over spaghetti. This wasn't merely a personal vendetta. It was a masterclass in economic warfare that predated and paralleled the more famous civil rights boycotts that would capture national attention. Just 8 months later, Rosa Parks would refuse to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus, sparking a 381-day boycott that crippled the city's transit system and became a defining moment of the civil rights movement. The Montgomery bus boycott succeeded for the same reason Bumpy's campaign against Mel's restaurant succeeded. It revealed the economic dependency that white business owners had on black customers, a dependency that generations of racial superiority rhetoric had trained them to ignore or minimize. What Vincent Mel failed to understand, what countless business owners across America failed to grasp, was that the economic landscape had fundamentally shifted. The Great Migration had transformed Harlem from a predominantly white neighborhood into the capital of Black America. By 1955, black residents weren't just a customer base to be tolerated, they were the customer base, period. White families had been moving out for decades, relocating to suburbs and other neighborhoods, leaving behind businesses that now depended almost entirely on black patronage for survival. Mel could maintain his internal sense of superiority. He could harbor his prejudices. He could even express them through subtle daily indignities. But he could not sustain a business that actively rejected the very people who kept his doors open. Bumpy Johnson recognized this economic reality with crystal clarity. His power in Harlem didn't stem solely from his control of illegal enterprises or his connections to organized crime. It came from his deep integration into the community's social fabric, his reputation as someone who reinvested in Harlem rather than simply extracting wealth from it. When Bumpy called for a boycott, people listened not just because they feared him, but because they trusted him. They understood that his fight against Mel's disrespect was their fight too. Every black customer who had been seated near the kitchen instead of by the window, every patron who had endured a cold stare or a muttered insult, every family that had spent their hard-earned money in an establishment that barely concealed its contempt, they all had a stake in teaching Vincent Mel an unforgettable lesson. The speed of Mel's collapse reveals another crucial dimension of economic leverage, the vulnerability of small businesses operating on thin margins. Restaurants, particularly in the 1950s, survived on consistent daily traffic. They ordered fresh ingredients, paid staff wages, covered rent and utilities, all predicated on predictable customer flow. A single day of empty tables might be survivable, but 24 hours of zero revenue, with all the same fixed costs still mounting, with perishable food rotting in the kitchen, with staff standing idle and questioning their job security, that was catastrophic. Bumpy didn't need a prolonged campaign. He simply needed to demonstrate that he could turn the tap of customers on and off at will, and that Mel's business existed entirely at the community's pleasure. This approach to justice through economic pressure would become increasingly sophisticated throughout the civil rights movement. The Montgomery bus boycott, the lunch counter sit-ins, the selective buying campaigns organized by groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, all operated on the same fundamental principle that Bumpy Johnson employed that night in Harlem. They recognized that in a capitalist society, money represents a form of voting, and marginalized communities could cast their economic votes in ways that forced systemic change. White business owners and city officials who might ignore moral arguments or legal challenges could not ignore empty buses, shuttered lunch counters, and plummeting revenues. Yet there's a critical distinction worth noting. Bumpy Johnson operated outside legal frameworks, using his influence as a crime boss to organize collective action. The later civil rights movement would employ similar economic tactics but with an explicitly nonviolent, legally protected frameworks of protest. Both approaches shared the recognition that economic power could be wielded for social justice, but they differed fundamentally in their relationship to law and legitimacy. Bumpy's method was effective but reinforced his role as an outlaw authority figure. The civil rights movement's approach sought to use economic pressure to transform legal and social structures themselves, creating lasting institutional change rather than simply punishing individual actors. When Vincent Mel stood outside Bumpy's office, 24 hours after his act of public disrespect, he represented more than one man's humiliation. He embodied the collapse of an entire social order that had taken black customers' money while denying them dignity. His journey from proud restaurant owner to desperate supplicant traced the arc of economic reality overtaking racial fantasy. Bumpy Johnson had simply accelerated a process that was already underway, using his unique position and influence to teach a lesson that reverberated far beyond one empty restaurant. The message was clear: economic participation without social respect was no longer acceptable, and communities had the power to enforce that principle with their wallets. The confrontation between Bumpy Johnson and Vincent Mel wasn't ultimately about a restaurant reservation. It was about dignity in an era when Black Americans were systematically denied it. Bumpy's calculated response to public humiliation reveals how respect functioned as a form of social currency in 1950s Harlem, perhaps more valuable than actual money. While Bumpy was a criminal by legal standards, his role as community protector stemmed from his willingness to defend collective dignity when legal systems offered no protection. This keynote examines the complex social dynamics of neighborhoods where formal justice systems failed to serve certain populations, creating space for alternative power structures. It raises uncomfortable questions about why communities sometimes turn to figures operating outside the law, and what that reveals about institutional failures in protecting human dignity across racial lines. To understand why Bumpy's response resonated so powerfully throughout Harlem, we must recognize that respect operated as a parallel economy in Black communities during the Jim Crow era and its immediate aftermath. While white Americans could take their dignity for granted as a birthright, Black Americans had to fight for every ounce of it, defending it daily against 1,000 small assaults designed to reinforce their supposed inferiority. A white customer could walk into any establishment expecting courteous service as a baseline. A Black customer in 1955 entered every transaction wondering whether they would be treated as a human being or as something less. This constant uncertainty, this perpetual vigilance, this never-ending negotiation for basic respect extracted an enormous psychological toll that white society rarely acknowledged or understood. When Vincent Mel threw Bumpy Johnson out of his restaurant in front of 50 witnesses, he wasn't simply refusing service to one man. He was making a public declaration that Black people, regardless of their status or influence, could be humiliated with impunity on his property. The setting mattered enormously. Public humiliation carries exponentially more weight than private disrespect because it forces witnesses to choose sides and establishes social precedents. Those 50 diners didn't just see one man ejected, they absorbed a lesson about power, hierarchy, and who belonged where. If Bumpy had absorbed that insult without response, the message would have been clear. Even the most powerful Black man in Harlem could be treated as inferior by any white business owner, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. This is precisely why Bumpy's retaliation had to be equally public and equally devastating. The response wasn't about personal vindication, it was about restoring collective dignity to an entire community. Every Black person who had ever been made to feel unwelcome in an establishment where they spent their money, every family that had swallowed insults to avoid confrontation, every individual who had been denied the simple respect of being treated as a valued customer, they all had a stake in Bumpy's counterattack. When Mel's restaurant emptied within hours and stayed empty, when this proud Italian businessman found himself financially ruined and begging for mercy, it represented a dramatic reversal of the expected social order. The message echoed through every conversation in Harlem: disrespect would no longer be cost-free. The concept of respect as currency becomes even more significant when we consider what Black Americans were systematically denied through legal and social structures. They couldn't vote freely in much of the country. They couldn't access equal education, housing, or employment opportunities. The courts rarely delivered justice when they were victims of crimes. Police protection was inconsistent at best, hostile at worst. In this environment, where formal institutions offered little recourse for grievances, respect became one of the few assets that communities could demand and defend themselves. It required no legal sanction, no institutional approval. It simply required collective will and the courage to enforce social consequences for violations. Bumpy Johnson's unique position made him the ideal enforcer of this respect economy. His criminal enterprises gave him financial independence. He didn't need white approval or white patronage to survive. His network throughout Harlem gave him the ability to mobilize collective action rapidly. His reputation for keeping his word and following through on commitments made his threats credible. But perhaps most importantly, his demonstrated commitment to the community, the Christmas presents for poor families, the jobs for young men, the intervention with abusive police, gave him moral authority that transcended his illegal activities. People didn't follow Bumpy's lead in boycotting Mel's restaurant because they feared him. The why followed because they trusted that when Bumpy demanded respect, he was demanding it on behalf of everyone who had ever been disrespected. This raises profound questions about the relationship between legality and legitimacy. The formal legal system in 1955 offered Black Americans limited protection against discrimination. While the Supreme Court had ruled against school segregation in Brown v. Board of Education just a year earlier, enforcement remained minimal and resistance was fierce. Public accommodations wouldn't be legally protected until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, nearly a decade away. In this gap between what the law said and what the law protected, informal power structures emerged to fill the void. Bumpy Johnson operated outside legal frameworks precisely because legal frameworks had failed his community so thoroughly. Yet this creates an uncomfortable paradox that we must confront honestly. When communities turn to criminal figures for protection and justice, it represents both an indictment of failed institutions and a potential perpetuation of harmful power dynamics. Bumpy could demand respect for his community because he commanded fear and loyalty through illegal enterprises. His ability to organize an instant boycott stemmed partly from his legitimate standing in the community, but also from his position atop Harlem's criminal hierarchy. People who defied Bumpy's wishes might face consequences beyond simple social disapproval. This means that while Bumpy's defense of dignity was genuine and his methods were effective, the power structure he represented wasn't purely democratic or consensual. The story forces us to consider what happens when societies create conditions where marginalized populations must choose between dignity and legality. When formal systems offer no protection for basic human respect, when discrimination is legal or tacitly accepted, when authorities are complicit in humiliation rather than defenders against it, communities will create their own justice systems. They will turn to whoever can deliver results, even if those individuals operate outside the law. Vincent Mel's journey from proud business owner to desperate supplicant wasn't just about one man's comeuppance. It was a manifestation of a larger truth. Respect cannot be indefinitely withheld from people who have the power to demand it. And when legal systems fail to protect dignity, communities will find other means to secure it. Bumpy Johnson simply became the instrument through which that truth was enforced, transforming an abstract principle into a concrete economic and social reality that no one in Harlem would forget. Vincent Mel's restaurant represents thousands of establishments across America where Black customers were technically served but never truly welcomed. The small cruelties described, cold stares, muttered slurs, seats near the kitchen, constituted a daily psychological warfare that the civil rights movement sought to dismantle. This keynote delves into the cumulative trauma of microaggressions before that term existed, exploring how seemingly minor acts of disrespect bled dignity out of people drop by drop. By 1955, legal segregation was crumbling, but social segregation remained entrenched in attitudes and practices. Mel's downfall illustrates a pivotal moment when old racial hierarchies collided with new demographic and economic realities. Business owners could no longer profit from Black communities while maintaining supremacist attitudes. The contradiction had become unsustainable, and Bumpy Johnson simply accelerated its collapse. The invisible war fought daily in establishments like Mel's restaurant was far more insidious than outright segregation. In the Deep South, whites-only signs at least had the virtue of clarity. Black customers knew exactly where they stood, knew which doors would slam in their faces, knew which water fountains were forbidden. The cruelty was explicit, codified into law, and therefore could be fought through legal challenges and organized resistance. But in places like Harlem in 1955, where segregation had never been legally enshrined to the same degree, discrimination wore a more sophisticated mask. The doors were technically open. The law said you had to be served, but 1,000 subtle signals communicated that you weren't really welcome, that your money was accepted but your presence was merely tolerated. Consider the psychological calculus that Black customers had to perform every time they entered such an establishment. You walk through the door and immediately begin reading the room. Does the hostess's smile reach her eyes, or does it freeze on her face? How long do you wait to be seated compared to white customers who arrived after you? When you're finally shown to a table, is it in the main dining room where you can see and be seen, or is it tucked away near the kitchen door, the restroom, or some other undesirable location? When the server approaches, is their tone professionally courteous or barely concealing contempt? Do they make eye contact or look past you as though you're invisible? How long between when you're ready to order and when someone actually comes to take that order? These calculations happened automatically, unconsciously, because survival in a hostile environment requires constant vigilance. The cumulative weight of these experiences cannot be overstated. Psychologists today recognize that repeated exposure to microaggressions produces measurable psychological harm, increased anxiety, depression, hypervigilance, and a phenomenon called racial battle fatigue. But in 1955, there was no vocabulary for this suffering, no framework for understanding why seemingly small slights could feel so devastating. Black Americans were expected to simply endure, to rise above, to prove their worth through dignified suffering. Meanwhile, white business owners like Vincent Mel could congratulate themselves for being more progressive than their Southern counterparts. After all, they served everyone, didn't they? They followed the law. What more could be expected? What they failed to grasp was that compliance with minimum legal standards, while maintaining maximum social hostility, represented a particularly cruel form of exploitation. Mel wanted black customers' money. He needed it to keep his three-generation family business alive in a neighborhood that had dramatically changed its demographic composition. But he didn't want to grant them the simple human courtesy of making them feel valued. He wanted economic participation without social equality, financial transactions without mutual respect. In his worldview, black customers should be grateful for the privilege of spending their money in his establishment, regardless of how they were treated once inside. This arrangement allowed him to profit from integration, while maintaining his sense of racial superiority intact. The tragedy is that countless black families chose to endure these indignities rather than make a scene. Parents swallowed insults so their children could enjoy a meal out. Couples accepted poor tables and slow service to celebrate anniversaries. Working people spent their hard-earned wages in places that barely concealed contempt for them, simply because options were limited and the alternative was giving up entirely on participating in public life. Each silent acceptance of disrespect felt like a small death of dignity, but speaking up carried its own risks. Complain about poor treatment and you might be labeled as oversensitive, angry, or troublesome. Push back against obvious discrimination, and you might find yourself forcibly removed, arrested, or worse. The system was designed to make resistance more costly than submission, to make swallowing humiliation seem like the rational choice. This is why Vincent Mel's public ejection of Bumpy Johnson represented such a catastrophic miscalculation. Mel had grown comfortable with the pattern of small cruelties that black customers absorbed without visible response. He had mistaken their strategic silence for powerlessness, their dignified restraint for weakness. He believed that the old rules still applied, that he could disrespect any black person, even Bumpy Johnson, with impunity, because that's how things had always worked. What he failed to recognize was that those daily humiliations had been building pressure like water behind a dam, and that the community was simply waiting for someone with the power and courage to channel that accumulated rage into effective action. The empty tables in Mel's restaurant the next night represented more than one boycott. They represented decades of swallowed insults finally finding expression, years of degrading treatment finally being answered, generations of quiet suffering finally being avenged. Every person who chose not to dine at Mel's wasn't just supporting Bumpy Johnson. They were reclaiming their own dignity, asserting that their patronage came with non-negotiable demands for basic respect. The boycott was personal for each participant, connected to their own experiences of being made to feel less than human in places that gladly accepted their money. What makes this moment historically significant is that it captures a turning point in American race relations. By 1955, the contradictions inherent in taking black customers' money while denying them dignity had become unsustainable. The economic power of black communities had grown too substantial to ignore. The patience of people who had endured generations of disrespect was wearing dangerously thin. The legal landscape was shifting, with Brown v. Board of Education signaling that courts might finally begin enforcing equality. And figures like Bumpy Johnson had the influence and infrastructure to translate individual grievances into collective action. Vincent Mel's journey from proud restaurateur to desperate supplicant traced the death of an old social order. He represented a generation of white business owners who believed they could have it both ways, profit from demographic change, while maintaining attitudes formed in an era of unchallenged white supremacy. Bumpy Johnson's response demonstrated that this contradiction would no longer hold. The invisible war of daily indignities would be met with visible consequences. The small cruelties that bled dignity drop by drop would be answered with economic pressure that bled profits just as surely. And business owners who wanted black customers' money would have to grant them something more fundamental: the simple respect of being treated as human beings whose patronage was valued, not merely tolerated. Bumpy Johnson's dual identity, criminal kingpin and community benefactor, challenges simplistic narratives about crime and morality. This keynote explores why communities embrace complicated figures who operate outside legal boundaries while serving social functions that legitimate institutions failed to provide. Bumpy distributed Christmas presents, created employment, and intervened with aggressive policing, filling gaps left by a society that had abandoned Black Harlem. His popularity stemmed not from criminal activity but from visible reinvestment in his community, creating a social contract that transcended legality. This presents a challenging examination of how systemic injustice creates space for alternative power structures, and why communities sometimes celebrate figures that broader society condemns. It forces consideration of what happens when official systems so thoroughly fail certain populations that illegal enterprises become engines of social support. The Robin Hood archetype has persisted across cultures and centuries precisely because it speaks to a fundamental human intuition about justice. When legal systems serve the powerful at the expense of the powerless, when wealth flows upward while poverty deepens below, when authorities protect property over people, communities will celebrate those who redistribute resources and defend the vulnerable, even when their methods fall outside legal boundaries. Bumpy Johnson embodied this archetype in 1950s Harlem, but his story complicates the folklore considerably. He wasn't stealing from the rich to give to the poor in any straightforward sense. He ran numbers rackets, controlled illegal gambling, and engaged in various criminal enterprises that extracted money from his own community. Yet somehow, he maintained genuine popularity and deep loyalty from the very people who funded his operations. Understanding this paradox requires examining what Bumpy provided that legitimate institutions refused to offer. Consider the social infrastructure that Bumpy Johnson maintained. When families in Harlem couldn't afford Christmas presents, Bumpy didn't just distribute toys. He restored dignity to parents who feared disappointing their children. He created moments of joy in lives marked by economic hardship. He demonstrated that someone with power actually cared about their struggles. When young men faced a choice between legitimate poverty and criminal enterprise, Bumpy provided a third option: work within his organization doing jobs that, while connected to illegal activity, offered wages, structure, and mentorship. When police officers, who were supposed to protect and serve, instead harassed and brutalized Black residents with impunity, Bumpy made phone calls that resulted in consequences for abusive cops, something the official complaint system almost never delivered. These weren't incidental gestures or cynical public relations moves. They represented a comprehensive alternative welfare system operating parallel to government institutions that had systemically failed Black communities. In 1955, the social safety net that would emerge during the Great Society programs was still a decade away. Aid to families with dependent children provided minimal assistance. Social Security excluded many of the occupations where Black workers were concentrated. Public housing was segregated and inadequate. Unemployment insurance had significant gaps in coverage. Into this void stepped figures like Bumpy Johnson, whose illegal enterprises generated capital that was then partially redistributed through informal community support networks. This creates profound moral complexity that resists easy categorization. Bumpy's numbers rackets operated as a regressive tax on hope, poor people gambling small amounts with astronomical odds, funding operations that made Bumpy wealthy. The communities he protected were also the communities he exploited. The young men he employed were also being drawn into criminal lifestyles that might ultimately destroy them. The power he wielded to intervene with police came from connections to organized crime and political corruption. None of this is defensible through conventional ethical frameworks. Yet when we zoom out and examine the broader context, we must confront uncomfortable questions about what alternatives existed. What legitimate pathways to economic power were available to a Black man born in 1905 South Carolina? What legal mechanisms existed for addressing police brutality against Black citizens in 1950s New York? What government programs provided adequate support for impoverished families in Harlem? What official channels offered recourse when business owners discriminated with impunity? The answer to all these questions reveals a system so thoroughly rigged against Black Americans that success within legal boundaries often meant accepting permanent subordination. Bumpy Johnson rejected that subordination and built power through the only channels available to him, channels that society had conveniently labeled criminal, while maintaining legal structures that ensured Black exclusion from legitimate wealth accumulation. The social contract between Bumpy and his community was therefore transactional but genuine. People understood that he profited from their gambling, but they also saw him reinvesting those profits visibly and consistently. They knew he was a criminal, but they measured that against the criminality of a legal system that denied them equal protection, economic opportunity, and basic dignity. They recognized the risks of his lifestyle, but they also appreciated that he used his power to defend community interests when no one else would. This wasn't naive hero worship. It was a sophisticated calculation about who actually provided material support and protection, versus who merely claimed moral authority while delivering nothing. The comparison to figures celebrated in mainstream American culture reveals striking double standards. Businessmen who built fortunes through exploitation of workers, environmental destruction, or financial manipulation are memorialized with buildings bearing their names and laudatory biographies. Politicians who maintained segregation and blocked civil rights are remembered as products of their time rather than architects of systemic oppression. Yet Bumpy Johnson, who operated outside the law partly because the law was designed to exclude him, receives no such generous interpretation. His crimes are personal moral failures rather than responses to structural violence. This isn't to absolve Bumpy of responsibility for harm caused by his criminal enterprises. The addiction, financial ruin, and violence connected to illegal gambling and organized crime inflicted real damage on real people. Families suffered when gambling debts consumed resources needed for basic necessities. Young people drawn into criminal life faced imprisonment or death. The normalization of illegal activity as a path to success had corrosive effects on community norms and aspirations. Any honest accounting must acknowledge these costs alongside the benefits Bumpy provided. What makes Bumpy Johnson's story so challenging is that it refuses to fit neatly into categories of hero or villain. He was both simultaneously a criminal who protected his community, an exploiter who provided essential services, an outlaw who enforced social justice when legal institutions failed. His existence reveals the moral bankruptcy of systems that create conditions where illegal enterprises become the most reliable providers of social support. When government abandons communities, when legal channels offer no path to dignity or prosperity, when official institutions serve everyone except those who need them most, those communities will create alternatives. They will turn to whoever delivers results, and they will construct moral frameworks that account for context rather than simply defaulting to legal definitions of right and wrong. Vincent Mel's humiliation at Bumpy's hands demonstrates this alternative moral framework in action. In legal terms, Bumpy had no authority to punish Mel's discrimination. But in community terms, he had every right, indeed, every obligation, to defend collective dignity. The boycott he organized wasn't legal recourse, it was social justice administered outside institutional channels that had proven useless. And when Mel stood begging outside Bumpy's office, he was acknowledging a form of authority that existed entirely outside legal recognition, an authority earned through action rather than granted through position. Bumpy Johnson's power to humble Vincent Mel came not from laws or badges or official titles, but from a community's decision that this criminal served them better than legitimate authorities ever had. The revelation that Bumpy had been waiting 6 months for this confrontation transforms the story from spontaneous retaliation into strategic planning. This keynote analyzes Bumpy's methodology. He didn't react impulsively to disrespect, but waited for the perfect moment to deliver a lesson that would echo through New York for decades. His response was measured, devastating, and entirely nonviolent, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of power dynamics and public relations. By forcing Mel to come begging rather than seeking him out, Bumpy controlled the narrative completely. This approach to conflict resolution, patient, strategic, and psychologically devastating, offers insights into effective power negotiation. The keynote examines how marginalized leaders throughout history have had to develop sophisticated strategy, precisely because they lacked access to conventional power structures, turning creativity and patience into weapons more effective than force. Strategic patience is perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of power. In popular imagination, strength manifests through immediate, overwhelming response. The gunfighter who draws fastest, the warrior who strikes first, the ruler who crushes opposition without hesitation. But true power often operates on a different timeline entirely. It waits, watches, and chooses the moment of maximum impact. Bumpy Johnson's 6-month observation period before Vincent Mel's public humiliation reveals a level of strategic sophistication that separated genuine power brokers from mere enforcers. During those 6 months, Bumpy wasn't passive. He was gathering intelligence, understanding patterns, identifying vulnerabilities, and constructing a response that would achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. Consider what Bumpy learned during his reconnaissance period. He understood Mel's business operations intimately, the restaurant's profit margins, its customer demographics, its dependence on evening dinner traffic, its reputation in the neighborhood. He mapped the social networks that sustained the establishment, identifying which community members were loyal customers and which attended only occasionally. He assessed Mel's personality, recognizing pride as the restaurateur's fundamental vulnerability. Most importantly, he waited for the right circumstances, a moment when Mel would act in ways that justified community response, when witnesses would be present to spread the story, when the lesson delivered would resonate far beyond one established. This patience served multiple strategic purposes. First, it ensured that when Bumpy acted, his response appeared proportionate rather than tyrannical. Had he moved against Mel without clear provocation, the boycott might have seemed like bullying, an abuse of power that could erode community support. By waiting for Mel to publicly disrespect him, Bumpy transformed defense of personal dignity into defense of collective dignity. The community didn't rally because Bumpy demanded it. They rallied because they recognized their own experiences in his humiliation and saw an opportunity to address accumulated grievances. Second, the waiting period allowed Bumpy to prepare the infrastructure for rapid mobilization. 6 months provided time to ensure that when he gave the word, the message would spread through every barbershop, beauty salon, church, and street corner in Harlem within hours. The psychology of making Mel come to him demonstrates another layer of strategic brilliance. Bumpy could have shown up at the restaurant with enough men to shut it down through intimidation. He could have demanded a public apology in front of the same witnesses who saw the initial disrespect. Instead, he orchestrated circumstances that forced Mel to voluntarily seek him out, to stand outside his office like a supplicant awaiting judgment, to beg for mercy from someone he had treated with contempt just 24 hours earlier. This reversal of positions was more psychologically devastating than any physical confrontation could have been. It transformed Mel from a man who threw Bumpy out into a man who couldn't survive without Bumpy's permission to operate. The power dynamic wasn't just equalized, it was completely inverted. This methodology reflects a broader pattern among leaders who operate from positions of structural disadvantage. When you lack access to legal systems, political institutions, or conventional economic power, you must develop alternative forms of leverage. You must become a master of timing, symbolism, and psychological warfare. You must turn your opponent's assumptions into weaknesses, and your own limitations into strategic advantages. History is filled with examples of marginalized leaders employing similar tactics. Gandhi's strategic use of fasting and nonviolent resistance to expose British brutality. Martin Luther King Jr.'s careful staging of confrontations that would generate sympathetic media coverage. Cesar Chavez's great boycotts that transformed agricultural labor disputes into moral crusades that engaged consumers nationwide. What all these approaches share is recognition that immediate gratification must sometimes be sacrificed for lasting impact. A quick, violent response to Vincent Mel's disrespect would have felt satisfying in the moment but would have confirmed stereotypes about black criminality and justified police crackdowns. It would have made Bumpy the villain and Mel the victim in the broader public narrative. Instead, by orchestrating an economic boycott that left Mel financially ruined without a single law being broken, Bumpy demonstrated power that was both undeniable and impossible to criminalize. Police couldn't arrest people for choosing not to eat at a particular restaurant. Authorities couldn't intervene to force customers through Mel's doors. The entire episode played out in a space where Bumpy's influence was absolute and official power was irrelevant. The claim that this confrontation would echo through New York for decades speaks to the performative dimension of power. Bumpy wasn't just punishing Vincent Mel, he was sending a message to every business owner in Harlem, every white establishment that had grown comfortable taking black money while withholding respect, every individual who thought racial hierarchies remained fixed and immutable. The message was clear and impossible to misinterpret. Disrespect would carry concrete economic consequences. Community solidarity could be mobilized rapidly and effectively, and the old order where white business owners could humiliate black customers with impunity was finished. This wasn't a threat that required constant reinforcement. One dramatic demonstration was sufficient to reshape behavior across countless interactions. The strategic patience also extended to how Bumpy handled Mel's inevitable surrender. He could have humiliated Mel publicly, could have demanded degrading acts of contrition, could have extracted financial compensation, or forced the sale of the restaurant. Instead, the story suggests he allowed Mel to return to business, presumably under a clear understanding of how customers would be treated going forward. This magnanimity after devastation served its own strategic purposes. It demonstrated that Bumpy's exercise of power was about establishing respect rather than pursuing vendetta. It showed that consequences for violation were severe, but that redemption was possible. Most importantly, it created a living example walking through Harlem, Vincent Mel, forever changed by his encounter with consequences, serving as a constant reminder of what happened when old attitudes collided with new realities. This approach to conflict reveals profound understanding of sustainable power. Destroying an opponent completely might feel satisfying, but it doesn't create the conditions for changed behavior across a broader population. Allowing a chastened opponent to survive and adapt sends a more nuanced message: respect the community and prosper, disrespect it and face ruin. But redemption remains possible for those who genuinely change. This framework created incentives for other business owners to self-correct rather than waiting for their own confrontation. It transformed Mel from an enemy to be destroyed into an example to be learned from, multiplying the impact of the lesson far beyond one restaurant. The broader implications extend well beyond 1955 Harlem. In any situation where conventional power structures are unavailable or unresponsive, strategic patience combined with careful preparation can achieve objectives that force never could. The ability to wait for the right moment, to ensure that when action comes it appears justified and proportionate, to control narratives through careful staging rather than crude domination. These capabilities define sophisticated power in ways that brute force never can. Bumpy Johnson's 6-month wait followed by 24 hours of devastating consequences demonstrates that patience isn't weakness or passivity. Sometimes it's the most ruthless strategy available, allowing time for opponents to create the conditions of their own destruction, while you prepare the means to ensure that destruction is complete, memorable, and instructive to everyone watching.